Alright, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are live. Welcome to the Whitfield Report. I am your host, Sam Whitfield, broadcasting live from NGC Studios here in Southern Florida. And I want to thank you so much for joining me tonight. Let's get right down to business, shall we? Tonight's show is going to be a little different from the usual. I actually do have a guest on tonight's show. Joshua Johnson, my colleague at American Watchman, will be joining me to talk about Trump's actions in Syria that were taken last night. I was actually on one of the unbearable live streams last night when that happened. And so we're going to be talking about that. Now, Josh and I, neither of us, for those of you who have listened to the podcast before, neither of us are big on intervention in Syria. And we've made that pretty public, both of us. Josh was actually on the program last year after the Syria strike, and we talked about how the strike in Syria could be potentially disastrous last year and how it's just not good. So we're going to be talking about Syria tonight. But in the meantime, for those watching on YouTube, like, hike, and bear share, and feel free to chime in the comments. I'll be checking the comments live during the show, although it is a pre-recorded interview, so that's what I'll be playing. And then for those of you watching on Periscope, as always, you can, as Lee Stranahan would say, retweet this puppy on Periscope, and be sure to retweet and give hearts. You can give me super hearts too if you want to. I still don't understand what those are really, but I appreciate them nonetheless. And so I want to thank people who are already chiming in. And without further ado, let's begin the interview with Joshua Johnson. I think it should be good. Enjoy. Alright, folks, so for today on the podcast, I finally have a guest on the podcast. It's a repeat guest, but Joshua Johnson is my colleague at American Watchman. Okay, he's one of the... Hold on a sec there, folks. The video was playing for me just a second ago. I don't know what's happening. It should have started playing, but it's not, so bear with me in the technical difficulties. Well, I sort this out. It should start playing. Okay. Yeah, I know, technical hookups. I'm still trying to learn the OBS software. Thanks for quick sharing, Cannabear. Let's see. We will get this interview started. It's more of a case of if the file will work, which it should, because it did earlier. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's see here. Well, this is weird. The file is not playing. So I guess this is the episode where OBS ate my file or something like that. Let me just try something here real quick. Thanks for bearing with me while I sort this out. Okay, well, let's see if this works now. Yep. Alright, folks, so for today on the podcast, I finally have a guest on the podcast. It's a repeat guest, but Joshua Johnson is my colleague at American Watchmen. He's one of the co-founders and editors, and he's most notably probably our top foreign policy expert. And with all the crap going on in Syria right now, I figured I would invite him on the show. So, Josh, thanks for coming on. And I guess first question is World War III looming?
Well, it's good to be on the show. Thanks for having me back on again. I don't think World War III is looming, but I would say that I think the hands on the clock are definitely a few more minutes closer to midnight, and that we are certainly not in a international climate right now that's conducive to peace. Regarding the attack on Syria last night, thank God not a single, as the Russian Ministry of Defense reported this morning, not a single Syrian civilian was killed, nor anybody within the Syrian military. And even if Syrian military personnel had been killed in the strike, which would have been horribly tragic, it's a shame when anyone dies. Even if they had been, I don't think that would have triggered World War III. I think the biggest risk out of running these types of strikes on Syria is what would happen if we had killed Russian or Iranian personnel on the ground there. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, our rockets, the areas that we had been targeting, were not actually within range of any of their defense areas. Whether or not that is believable or not, we can't tell. But we know that for sure. We know that the Russian anti-air, air-to-surface-to-air missiles defense systems were up to snuff, because that's what the Syrian army uses. And of the 100-something missiles that we had shot at Damascus last night, over 70 were shot down. And there actually is video. It's pretty incredible to watch, actually, of the Syrian surface-to-air missiles taking out our Tomahawk cruise missiles in the air.
Well, we're going to be playing that on the side feed here, so viewers can see that. Now, you mentioned before we started this interview that you had some breaking news about Syria, and we might as well get into that. So, what do you have for us?
I did. So this morning at the United Nations Security Council, the United States envoy Nikki Haley is already warning that if Syria uses chemical weapons again, the United States is locked and loaded, quote unquote, to go in and take them out. But is that not an open admission that the Syrian regime never had any chemical weapons to begin with? Because after all, last night's attack was supposed to be, we were told that we were striking the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capabilities, facilities that produce chemical weapons, storehouses that might be stockpiling chemical weapons, and air bases that would serve as delivery systems for those chemical weapons, in the planes. But as far as I can tell, there should have been nothing for us to strike, which is why I don't buy the story, and I don't think anyone should buy the story that we were striking at their chemical weapons capabilities last night. We were striking at their air capabilities because that has been the single biggest factor in Assad's success against the terrorists, his ability to conduct airstrikes on them, not with chemical weapons, but with conventional arms. The State Department in 2014, along with the United Nations, after our deal with the Russians and Syrians to dismantle the Syrian chemical weapons program, both our State Department and the UN confirmed that they had dismantled and handed over all of their chemical weapons. And yet the attacks continued to happen, and our State Department blamed Assad under both Obama and now Trump. So how can Nikki Haley be saying if we took out his alleged capabilities, which he shouldn't have had by our own admission in the first place, if we had taken those out last night, how could he launch another chemical strike? I think, going back to your first question about the possibility of a world war or a wider war, the Syrian war becoming escalating even further, I think the greatest risk now is what happens after another chemical strike is staged by the terrorists framing the Syrian government. Because each time we have seen this since Trump has become president, he's actually gotten bigger and bigger. First, in 2017, last year, after the staged attacks, it was a relatively minor airstrike against a single Syrian airbase, which resulted in a nearby village being wiped out by ISIS that airbase had been protecting. Now, after another alleged chemical attack that nobody has been able to verify who did it yet, the OPCW investigators are just going in this morning. We see multiple airstrikes against primarily Damascus, but if you look at the map of our targets, it's actually fairly well spread out against all of Syria. We even hit the Aleppo International Airport, as I understand it. So what happens next time after another staged chemical attack? Will that be the excuse used by Trump and others in the United States federal government and the establishment to push for all-out war and invasion? I hope that we never have to find out, but I think that's the greatest risk we have going forward. And the fact that Nikki Haley is admitting that this morning at the United Nations would seem to me to be proof that it's almost a blatant admission that our leaders are lying. Because why would you have to warn the Syrians not to use chemical weapons again if we had allegedly taken them all out last night, as Trump indicated this morning with his tweets claiming it was quote-unquote mission accomplished?
The thing that has always kind of bothered me about this whole thing with Syria, and we talked about this last year when you were on the first time that this happened, which I can't believe that was a year ago. Time certainly does fly, but one thing that really has kind of bothered me is the fact that even the New York Times this morning, I was reading, in their headline, admitted that this was an alleged chemical attack. Now, that doesn't sit too well with me because I don't like the idea of us attacking Syria based on like an alleged chemical attack. I mean that's like saying that you're going to prosecute a bank robber on an alleged, robbery that they may have committed, but that but there's like a 10% chance that they might not have. Maybe that's like a poor analogy, but I feel like we're kind of doing the same thing. We're striking we're striking at Syria when there's still like a chance that they weren't the ones responsible.
Well, there are a few important things to remember here. First off, as Secretary of Defense Mattis admitted yesterday, we do not have any actual evidence that the Syrian government did it. And nor do we even have any evidence that a chemical attack occurred. That's where the alleged part comes in. Now, I'm fairly certain that a chemical attack did occur, but I'll go into that later. I just don't think that the Syrian government did it. But Mattis admitted we have no evidence that an attack even occurred. What we have is some video from social media that cannot be verified because it was taken on the ground by biased activists from Jaish al-Islam. In the United Kingdom, it's even more farcical because this morning Theresa May was discussing it, and she's actually calling these social media posts, quote unquote, open source intelligence. So she's saying we launched these airstrikes based on open source intelligence we had, which basically translates to we're launching these airstrikes based on some videos we saw on the internet, but we're not really sure if they're telling the truth or not. Which is all the more ironic when you think about it, because wasn't after the 2016 election, wasn't everybody and their brother freaking out about news on the media and how it could be fake, and how just because you saw stuff on the internet didn't mean it was true? Now suddenly the same people are saying, "Oh my God, I saw a video on the internet. It's definitely true. We have to go and attack." The second thing that's important to remember is that there has been no formal investigation yet. The United Nations has not been able to get down in there. It was in fact interesting because the OPCW just announced yesterday, I think about an hour before Trump came out and announced that we would begun bombing. They announced yesterday that they would be going to Syria, to Duma, to actually begin a formal investigation into the attacks. And then we couldn't wait for that. We just decided to go and bomb, which is a violation of international law because Syria is a UN member state and they are entitled to an investigation. And the interesting thing about that is that in 2013's attack, the Syrian government was able to get UN investigators on the ground. And in the 2013 attack, the UN found no evidence that the Syrian government had actually committed it. They cleared them. And if you remember, there had been to date, I believe, four major chemical attacks. The 2013 one I just referenced. There was another one in 2015 where Obama caught crap for allegedly not enforcing his red line again, which I might add is marked nonsense because we have been bombing Syria almost constantly now for almost since the beginning of the Civil War. Obama is just as guilty of bombing Syria as Trump is. It's just that the media didn't want to make him look like a warmonger, so they didn't praise him quite as well. Although they did make clear he was arming terrorists, but that's a bit on a tangent. So there was the 2013 one, the 2015 one, the 2017 one, and now the one in Duma a few days ago. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope I am wrong, but I can just see, and perhaps maybe it'll be another year to the day, because if I'm not mistaken, I think the one last year was in April as well. But maybe next April we'll see another chemical attack staged by the terrorists, and our government will immediately rush to blaming Assad based on some sketchy videos they saw on the internet. And that might spark a war. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm afraid that's where this might eventually lead to.
Yeah, like I said a few minutes ago, I mean, I checked the podcast archive a few minutes ago, and I think the last time I had you on to talk about Syria was actually like maybe not a year to the day, but it was around this time last year that I had you on to discuss the Syria attack too. So that's that's kind of eerie that it's happened so close to the last one.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I do agree with you that there actually is an attack right now. As you just said, there's no evidence to suggest that Syria has done it. I have my theories as to who is behind the attack, but do you have any theories on your end as to who might be responsible?
Well, there are two groups that I would immediately suspect in this particular case. The first, most obvious one would be Jaish al-Islam, which translates to the Army of Islam, and they were the Islamist terrorist group that was occupying Duma at the time of the attack. They were trying to prevent the Syrian Arab Army, the SAA, from liberating the city at the time. And so they would be my first suspect, obviously, just because they were the ones that were in control of the ground there. It would be incredibly easy for them to either stage an attack or to set off a chemical weapon of their own making in the city square. The other suspect I would have, and I say this only because they've shown up at almost all of the other chemical attack areas. I'm not quite sure if they were in Duma or not, though. Is the Syrian White Helmets, and they are allegedly a humanitarian organization. But the interesting thing, and they're called the White Helmets because they wear these sort of white helmets to identify themselves. The idea being that, like the Red Cross, you won't get shot or whatever. But they are Saudi funded. And they happen to turn, and they're also oftentimes where you get these videos coming out of Syria saying, "Oh, help us, help us." There's very coordinated, very biased activists engaged in a coordinated media campaign. But they are always there where whenever you have a chemical attack, allegedly to do humanitarian work, but there have been a number of instances where their official stories don't line up with the facts on the ground, and where they themselves are in areas where they shouldn't have been. I wouldn't rate them as highly as suspects as I would Jaish al-Islam, for obvious reasons. One is a terror group. The other one is at worst an armed group functioning for the Saudi government. But and in any event, I should note that the Saudis are arming the terrorists as well as the white helmets and funding them. But those would be my two immediate suspects. And the reason I would suspect Jaish al-Islam and any quote unquote rebel group in particular is because for the past almost 2 years now, the Syrian Arab Army has been finding evidence of makeshift chemical weapons workshops in cities such as Aleppo and eastern Ghouta, where they are seeing where they're finding evidence that the terrorists were attempting or successfully even manufacturing small chemical weapons, the kind that could be used to either launch a successful chemical attack, which is what I think is most likely, or B, just enough to stage an attack and then get the appropriate chemicals onto people to make it appear as though they were involved in an actual attack. But I think the former is more likely. I think they're actually producing chemical bombs, which they are able to plant in highly populated areas with high concentrations of people, and then set off and make it look like the Syrian government has launched the attack.
Very well. There's a lot to unpack there, for sure. So I guess the next question is, if Syria isn't responsible for this, why? I mean, it's been proven in the past that they haven't been responsible for these attacks. So why do the neocons and the war machine, why do they keep pushing the Syria narrative when clearly there's evidence to contradict that Syria is responsible?
Well, there's a very simple reason. There are multiple reasons, I should say, but they're all relatively simple ones for why the not just the neocons, but the establishment, left and right, why the military-industrial complex so desperately wants regime change in Syria. And these are, and I'm going to list them off. I'm not listing them off in any particular order, but just as they come to mind. First, I would say the oil companies, who have reason to want to go into Syria, where most oil companies are state-owned. So the oil companies in Wall Street are not profiting off these companies. They're state-owned Syrian oil companies. Want to go in there and take the oil. Particularly, they want to gain control over Aleppo, because underneath Aleppo, there's a network of oil pipelines which control the flow of oil throughout most of the region, particularly going into and coming out of Iran. You control Aleppo. This is why that was the focal point for so long. You control Aleppo and you control the flow of the oil. So that would be one reason. The other reason is because the Syrian government has dumped the dollar, and this would be why Wall Street in particular doesn't wants to have regime change. The Syrian government has dumped the dollar, and they're one of several countries across the world that does not have any IMF debt. And if you notice, countries that tend to buck from the IMF, like Venezuela, for example, or obviously Syria or Iran, whenever they buck the dollar and go against the IMF, suddenly Wall Street begins to paint them in not so pretty of colors, regardless of if they're democratic or if they are a dictatorship. So that's another reason. The third reason would be the arms industry, the war lobby. They make money in any war, regardless of who it is against, and that's a given. And then finally, I would say, and this is perhaps the only, in all these other reasons, you can see clear examples of monetary gain to be had in getting a regime change in Syria. But this is one of the few where it seems to be almost purely political, and that would be the imperialist motive. And this would be where I think John McCain and co. sort of fit in, although, of course, there's no doubt in my mind he is influenced by his campaign donors. But that is because Syria has, since the 1970s, been a Russian ally. The Russian port in, I believe, Tartus, Syria, and I'm probably butchering that name, Tartus or Tartus, Syria, is Russia's only access to the Mediterranean Sea. And so those who are Russophobic and who want to sort of box Russia in and take Russia over, just like they want to Syria, will obviously want to have regime change in Syria in order to get rid of that Russian naval base there. And also because they just want to have a government in Syria that will do what it is told by the United States. I think in the United Kingdom right now, we're seeing a pretty clear example of this, because in the UK they obviously took part in the attacks last night, but their people were not informed by Prime Minister Theresa May until about 30 minutes after Trump made the announcement. So imagine that, hearing that your country is bombing some other country, and you find that out from another country's president telling you that your army is helping his army attack someone else before your own government says it. And she didn't even allow this time for Parliament to consult or have a vote on whether or not this military action should be undertaken. Probably because she knew that the government would lose the vote in Parliament, just like they did in 2013. But it's just incredibly telling, and I think opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn is doing a brilliant job of highlighting this. How the United Kingdom essentially just did what America wanted it to, even though the majority of its own people were not wanting to be part of this. And even though if it were brought to a vote, the majority of Parliament would probably not want to be involved in this. But Theresa May went ahead, did what Donald Trump told her, and then the British people didn't even find out until afterwards. It is a perfect example of American imperialism. In fact, in the United Kingdom, as I understand it, their Trident nuclear defense system cannot be activated without FIRST, which is their nuclear weapons program, which I am against. But they cannot activate it. They can't do anything with it until they consult the Pentagon first. It's just a brilliant example of the kind of government that Washington would prefer Syria have, a puppet that does whatever it is told.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely it's definitely unnerving. I mean, how much power the military industrial complex in this country has over other foreign entities. I mean,
Not just foreign entities. I think
yeah.
you raise the amount of power they have. I would note also that Trump is the third president in a row now who was elected on a relatively dovish foreign policy and then wound up bombing another country or going to war within his first term.
Well,
People forget this now, because of everything that's happened. But when Bush was first elected and when Obama was first elected, both of them promised to try and end all these pointless conflicts overseas. And then the next thing you know, they get in there, and within their first term, it's like some foreign policy machine takes over and immediately has them begin breaking all of their promises and going about with business as usual.
Well, with Trump, it seems to be. I find it oddly suspicious how all of his advisors, all of his good advisors, were slowly replaced by neocons. So unlike Mike Cernovich and some other individuals, I'm not actually mad at Trump for this, because I think he's just doing what his advisors are, are telling him to do, and I don't think he has that many good advisors anymore. Mattis, I think, is one of them, but as you said last night in a private chat, Mattis, I guess, may be on the way out soon.
I think he is, because I think John Bolton already threatened when he first was coming in as national security advisor that he was going to clean house and in the National Security Council. But I think he's pushing very strongly to get Mattis out of there, because the Mattis is the lone voice of reason. And it's a bit ironic saying that, because Mattis is a guy who's on record saying that it's fun to shoot people. So it's gotten pretty bad when the guy who says it's fun to shoot people is the last sane man in the White House National Security team. But
well, it kind of is, though. I mean, he's being honest about it. And see, that the thing I've always said about Mattis is, because people think that he would be a war hawk, and I'm like, no, Mattis just likes to kill, terrorists and evil motherfuckers who need to be killed. But he's not. because he's a warrior, he's not necessarily the same thing as like a neocon, because warriors understand war. And you would think that McCain, being a Vietnam vet, would be a little bit more sympathetic, but I think now he's been in politics longer than he ever was in the military. Kind of, whereas Mattis is the exact opposite. He's been in the military for the vast majority of his life. And, is now just.
Well, with respect to McCain, you know what they say: sound doesn't travel so well from the past. So I can't say for sure whether or not young McCain would approve. I have a hard time believing that the young John McCain would approve of half of the stuff we do now. Although I will say, to McCain's credit, even though I disagree with the man on almost everything, I would say to his credit, because he was tortured by the North Vietnamese, to his credit, he has been consistent in opposing the use of torture by the U.S. military. Now, that's sort of undercut by the fact that he was A-OK with arming groups that tortured people and shot people's heads off. But, I guess if there's anything good to be said about him, it's that he was against the enhanced interrogation programs.
Which coincidentally is an area where he and I actually disagree. I think that enhanced interrogation, it's not necessarily the same. Enhanced interrogation and torture are two completely different things. But I would rather that we did it as opposed to as opposed to sending other governments or external agencies to do it, because I've actually met some. Well, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I've met some people who were former intelligence officers, and trust me, they have ethics compared to some of the other people.
I guess my reply to that would be, why torture anybody at all, either ourselves or having somebody do it? It's immoral. And as far as I understand, there's no evidence that actually suggests it gets us any valuable intel. People will just tell you anything to make you stop torturing them. So, I mean, that would be that. But I think that's somewhat off topic from the main focus of our program today.
Yeah. I guess, how do you think this will impact, do you think this will impact Trump's re-election chances?
I'm glad you asked that question, because it sort of ties back to a thought I had a few moments ago. You were talking about the influence of Trump's advisors, which I certainly think is a factor.
Yeah.
But I also think Trump himself, at the end of the day, I think Donald only cares about Donald. And so, obviously, because the media fawns over him, both left and right, CNN, Fox News, everybody in the media fawns over him whenever he decides to go and be a warmonger and bomb Syria. I think that Trump wants desperately to distract from the increasingly widening sexual and FBI-related scandals he has going on, and so of course, bombing Syria gets him a little bit of coverage for a little while on that front. But whether it will impact his election, I don't know. I think that would be something for us to be concerned about going forward. Will another chemical strike be launched sometime before the 2020 election by the terrorists, and then be used as an excuse to justify a war in order to win a second term? We know that the rally around the flag effect certainly worked well for Bush. He was able to get the country to come behind him before going into Iraq in 2004. And in 2003, it was leading up to the 2004 election. He was able to use the war in Iraq to rally support for himself at first. But I think in the shorter term, with respect to the midterms, I think this is going to actually help the Democrats, because you see so many people within Trump's base splitting down the middle on this issue. And this demoralizes a great many people who voted for Trump specifically because they liked the fact he was not in favor of foreign adventurism with the military.
Yeah.
And I think this demoralizes a lot of them. They may sit home. They may not even go out and vote in the midterms. And then others may be so busy fighting each other, those who split down the middle on this issue, that the Democrats are able to come in and maybe siphon some off. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I definitely think it's going to have an impact on the midterms, along with some other huge mistakes he's made in his first term so far, like the tax bill that I'm not too keen on, and the fact that he seemingly has completely chosen to ignore his infrastructure promise, which I think will come back directly with respect to this issue because of all the money we wasted on those rockets last night that could have been spent on infrastructure spending.
Not
So I think there will be an impact there. I don't know if this will affect the 2020 election, although I think there is reason for us to be concerned that he could try using a war over there to boost his support going into 2020. I think that's a definite risk. But short term, I definitely think it'll impact the midterm elections. Yes.
you mentioned that he's worrying about all this sexual harassment stuff and the FBI stuff. And I would just have to say that it's ironic that if that's the case, that he's using this to get in people's good graces, because I don't know about you, but no one I know really gives a crap anymore about the FBI or Stormy Daniels.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I think that I think everything with James Comey and all that. I definitely think it's a sideshow to distract from real issues, because so long as our leaders are all busy investigating all these silly, almost soap opera-ish
Right, yeah.
scandals, as long as they're doing that, they don't actually have to discuss the real issues in our country that are concerning people, like infrastructure and like ending the endless wars and like income inequality and all of that. They just got to focus on that, and they got to ignore all of the real issues. I think that's definitely I don't think many people care about that, but I think Trump understands that those within the political class in this country definitely are making a case about that. And I think the idea that he'll be able to permanently get them within his get in their good graces by doing what they want on policy areas like Syria, I think it's a fallacy for him to think that. Because, as you know, as I said before, Mike Pence is much more of a neocon than Trump is. Mike Pence was eager to go to war in Syria back during the vice presidential debates when Trump was actually contradicting him still. So I think more than anything, Trump should be worried about the fact that his vice president is more attractive to those who want him gone than his kowtowing to them is.
Yeah, well, and that's what worries me too. Is even if Trump does appease the right left establishment in the military industrial complex, right? Even if he does go along, these are people who, at the end of the day, still don't like him, who still hate his guts, who probably wish that Hillary, still won the election, and so why he's choosing to kowtow them, at least at the moment, that's what it looks like, it is beyond me. I really don't understand it. Although at the same time, I don't buy this notion either from the hardcore, Trump people who are saying, oh, he's just playing, this is all 4D chess. It's like, okay, at what point are you guys going to stop using the 4D chess excuse, for every move Trump makes?
I think the most frustrating thing about Trump is the fact that he is Trump. And by that, I mean, I saw, for example, last night, they were having, and I always have the news running in the background. I don't actually watch it. It's just sort of force of habit.
Right.
I read the most of my news, but I had the news running in the background last night during the attacks. And they had some talking heads on Fox News, and Sebastian Gorka was one of them, and he was obviously pro Syria strikes, and there was some other guy who was against the Syria strike. And the other guy was essentially raising all of the issues that our foreign interventionism has caused in the past. And Sebastian Gorka just kept saying, not with this president, not with this president. And you're sitting here just thinking, oh, well, I'm sorry, I forgot that Trump is, the God Emperor Trump is infallible and can make no mistakes because of his golden hair. But yeah, that's the mentality I seem to get from a lot of people. They're like, oh, well, he knows what he's doing. Well, let's be honest at this point. I mean, I think we've been honest on this program before pretty well. Trump isn't really a smart guy. All right. At the end of the day, I think he's an idiot who often just listens to his advisors who are around him and who acts on his impulses. I don't think there is any master plan. I don't think there's anything such thing as 4D chess. I don't think Trump even knows how to play normal chess. So I think that at some point people who are who would be normally disappointed who supported him need to be honest with themselves and admit that they're getting screwed, just like a lot of the other people he's screwed over in the past.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I've said this. The reason why, the whole reason I voted for Trump wasn't necessarily because I liked Trump, but because I hated Hillary more. And I mean, I've always been pretty clear about that, and yet, that was what because we supported, Trump, we got, canned from the previous publication that you and I were both at. Now though, it seems as if, I mean, I don't want to make this conclusion yet, but Trump could very well be the same as Hillary in regards to foreign policy.
Oh yeah, no doubt. But on the issue of foreign policy, what he did last night was the exact thing Hillary wanted to do, although she would have probably done it sooner. And there is now essentially no difference between Trump's foreign policy and Hillary's foreign policy, or for that matter, Obama's foreign policy. Just like there was no difference between Obama's foreign policy and Bush's foreign policy. This is the same continuous Washington consensus that we've had for some time, and it's not working. Quite frankly, it's quite destructive and it's quite dangerous to peace.
Yeah, I found an interesting interview yesterday. I don't know how I stumbled upon this. I was looking stuff up on Syria and Trump and politics. I just kind of threw in like a, a mashup of things into Google, and interesting enough, I found this interview from Playboy magazine of all places, with Jerry Springer. And Jerry Springer was actually, I couldn't believe it, but this interview was actually pretty well written, and Springer made the case. And keep in mind, this interview is 30 something years old now, but he basically made the statement that absolute power corrupts. That if you get into politics, no matter what your intentions are, the longer you're in power, the more it will corrupt you. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing that with Trump. I think he did, run maybe with noble intentions, but also because of who Trump is. I think, the power of the presidency is perhaps corrupting him at a faster rate than we initially thought. But that's just kind of my theory.
I don't think it's just the. I think that's obvious. I think that's certainly the case. But I don't think it's just the presidency. I think that that's a very systemic problem. For example, the fact that we don't have term limits for members of Congress, and so you have people like Lindsey Graham who have been sitting there for years saying that we need to be everywhere all the time, bombing everyone everywhere. And I think that part of the reason you see so much opposition from the Washington establishment on both the left and the right to the implementation of term limits is precisely because I don't know if I would say it would completely wipe the military industrial complex out. I don't think it would. But I think if you imposed term limits and cleaned house with Congress and got a whole bunch of new people in there, I think you would instantly see at least some weakening of the military industrial complex and the Washington consensus. Obviously, there would still be issues. We need to make we need to take a lot of action in terms of campaign finance reform so that these corporations that are constantly in favor of war cannot be buying out all of our politicians. But I think term limits would be a huge step in the right direction, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, term limits are a big part of this. Also, I hate to say this, but Veterans Affairs reform, is also needed. That's something I've been talking on the show for, almost a decade since I've started doing this too. The VA system. I hate to sound like a pessimist, but I think that subconsciously that the VA likes having wounded veterans because it keeps them in business somewhat. And some of these veterans are forced to work within the system. So right now it's just airstrikes, but I'm hoping that we won't have to put soldiers on the ground in Syria.
I think going back to what I started out with saying, I think, and I would urge all of your listeners to definitely keep that in their prayers and to call their representatives, write their representatives, call the White House, write the White House, do whatever you can to make your voice heard. But I would definitely say that going forward, one of the biggest threats to world peace would be what happens if another chemical, and there's no doubt about it in my mind, there will be at some stage in the future, there will be another staged chemical weapons attack. Because you and I both know, and as I mentioned earlier on with the program, Nikki Haley, by her own admission this morning, warning them if another one happens, which would indicate that she knows that the possibility is still there because we weren't bombing chemical weapons facilities last night because there were none. I think the greatest risk is another staged chemical weapons attack that will be blamed on the Syrian government and used as justification for starting a war. There's no doubt in my mind.
So sorry to interject. I should have asked this like at the beginning of the interview, but if we didn't bomb chemical plants, what the hell did we bomb? Do we even know at this point what we
Well, we know what we told. We know what we've been told that we bombed. For example, the Syrian International Airport in Aleppo. Obviously, that was bombed. There was in Damascus, Syria. We bombed the. Forgive me if I get the name wrong, but it was something to the effect of the Syrian National Institute for Sciences, which, according to our government, was a chemical weapons research facility. I kind of doubt it, but what we were striking at primarily was Syrian airfields, because this was the original goal that was presented to Trump. He was told by Mattis and others that the airstrike should focus on wiping out the Syrian Air Force. That has not happened, thanks to the fact that Trump tweeted about it the other day, which, in my opinion, just shows that he's not quite as bright as people think he is, although there are definitely people out there who are saying, oh, it was 4D chess. But the Syrian military was able to move a lot of their airplanes in the time between Trump's tweets about a strike coming and last night. Not only that, but the Syrian Air Defense Forces were able to take out with their surface-to-air missiles a good chunk of the Tomahawk cruise missiles that would have otherwise hit their assets. But we definitely did damage to their airfields, which will hamper any attempts to launch those airplanes for a little while, at least until the tarmacs are repaired. And the great risk there is, as I said earlier, that the Syrian Air Force has been, with using conventional weapons, using normal bombs, has been the Syrian government's greatest asset in the war against terrorists so far, because that's how they've been able to claim victory. Last night it was reported that ISIS and terrorist forces were attacking, I believe, and forgive me if I butcher the name again, the Yarmouk encampment right outside of Damascus. I've not seen anything beyond the initial reports from journalists in the area about that, but I'll be looking into that more today, and I would encourage all of your listeners to do that as well. But we were hitting essentially last night Syrian air assets. That's what they were trying to take out. They want to, because it's believed that if you take out the Syrian Air Force, then the quote unquote rebel groups will have a better time overthrowing the regime. It was sort of the same deal in Libya. What doomed Gaddafi? Well, it was the no-fly zone, because he wasn't able to get his air force off the ground to allow his forces on the ground to overpower the rebels and terrorists he was fighting.
Which let's be clear on this too. I mean, we talked about this on the last podcast. You're not necessarily a fan of. Okay, let's talk about Bashir al-Assad, because I think the last time you were on, some listeners maybe got the impression that you were a fan of al-Assad, and I want to make clear that neither of us are necessarily fans of al-Assad.
Here's what I think of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. I think, obviously, Syria is a dictatorship. I do not think that they have, by any means, an ideal record on human rights. But they do have freedom of religion. As I mentioned earlier, there are more religious minorities living in Syria than anywhere else in the Middle East. They do this better than even Israel does. As I don't know if I've ever discussed with you on your show before, but Israel is not exactly friendly with their Christian population, especially not Palestinian Christians.
Yeah, yeah, we can go.
But to the
Into that.
the original point about Assad, yes, I am supportive of the Syrian government primarily because they are fighting terrorists. There are no moderate rebel groups at this point, and I think Rania Khalek, she is an American journalist who's reported extensively on this. She put it best on Twitter just this morning, saying she said something to the effect of, "If you're afraid of defending the Syrian government because you're afraid of being called an Assadist when the Syrian government is the only group on the ground over there actively fighting terrorists, then you shouldn't be involved in this debate at all, because you're obviously more interested in pushing an agenda than you are in defeating terrorists." I'm not necessarily a fan of Bashar al-Assad. But I do think that the Syrian people should be the ones to determine who is going to govern their country and what the future of their country is. And we've not been seeing that in the Syrian civil war. We've been seeing outside groups who are armed and funded by outside countries come in and try and overthrow the regime, and that's wrong. That would be the equivalent of, how would America react if Russia or Germany started arming and funding and training and shipping over groups of armed combatants with the stated intention of taking over our government and then pretending it was a civil war.
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, it's kind of the same case in Iraq too. The government was so hell bent on taking out Saddam Hussein, and granted, I mean, he was a sick bastard, no doubt, but removing him from power created a power vacuum, which got filled by ISIS and all these other radical groups. So you have to think that if Assad gets removed from power, what's to stop the same thing from happening there that happened in Iraq?
It's even more likely to happen in Syria. It's even more likely to happen in Syria because if you look at the situation with Iraq in 2003, there was not a civil war going on, and there were not multiple different groups fighting inside of the country. It was pretty cut and dried, straightforward at the beginning. It was the Iraqi government versus the coalition forces, and then in Syria, when you look at it, you have the Syrian government. You have God knows how many Islamist terror groups on the ground. You have the Kurds. You have now in the northern half of the country the invading Turkish forces. And then you have armies of convicts that have been released by Saudi Arabia from their prisons on the condition that they go and fight in Syria. Not even mentioning the Chechens that have been pouring, the Islamist militants from Chechnya that have been pouring into the country either. You have people from all over the world fighting with all different kinds of groups in Syria. And it's much more of a, forgive my language, but it's much more of a cluster F than it is than Iraq ever was. So the idea that you would somehow be able to avoid the mistakes of Iraq and Syria is just asinine, because the situation in Iraq going in was a hell of a lot more stable than the situation today in Syria is. If you took the Syrian government out today, rest assured things would get worse.
Oh yeah, totally. And and by the way, you can curse on my show too.
I know. I just trying not to. I was going to, and then I caught myself there.
Right. But, I've been trying to kind of cut down on that too. But I mean, the thing of it is, I don't take YouTube dollars. So especially since they banned Owen Benjamin from YouTube. But that's a whole another story for another time. I guess, finishing up this whole conversation about Syria, and this is going to kind of, I don't really know if we can answer this yet, but do you see any outcome right now to this scenario where things won't devolve into an even bigger mess? Is there a way to fix this whole situation?
Well, there is a way to fix the situation. I don't think it'll happen because at this point, I think Trump's already gone too far down the path of escalation to take this route. But here is what what I would suggest. And let me be clear also. Even though I think he's gone too far down, it's never too late to try and turn around. I think, but he could. I don't think he will. But here's what should be done. First, as Trump originally has tried to say twice now, right before each chemical attack coincidentally occurred, we should get out of Syria. We don't have a stake in this conflict. Syria poses no threat to us. There is no American interest that is actually at risk in Syria. And second of all, after America withdraws, we should work diplomatically with the United Nations to try and restart peace talks. There were several rounds of peace talks with the UN that have broken down and devolved. Funnily enough, at one point a few years ago, Russia actually offered to try and pressure Assad into stepping down and letting somebody else within the Syrian government take things over for the purposes of procuring a peace deal. And the United States, under Obama at the time, actually rejected this offer, saying, no, the entire Syrian government's got to be scrapped, which says quite a bit about what the actual goals of the U.S. in this whole deal are. But definitely get out of Syria and restart the United Nations, the UN peace talks in the conflict, because that is the only way you're going to achieve a peaceful outcome here. That said, though, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Trump's going to do that. I think that following the attacks last night, we have already escalated the conflict too much for Trump to try and do that. And the fact that he's already gone with the establishment narrative that it was the Syrian government who carried out these attacks, even though he has no evidence, it would be all but impossible for him to go back on his position now without him looking like somebody who was siding with, in his own words, a quote unquote gas killing monster.
Yeah, well, and so with that, folks, that pretty much concludes our interview on that happy and uplifting note. Anyway, though, Josh, thanks for coming on. And where can we find you on social media? Are you still on Twitter?
I actually left Twitter for a little while, and the reason why was because I joined Twitter when I was in junior high, and so I had the problem of following back everybody who followed me, which became inconvenient after a while because my Twitter feed was just full of crap that I didn't care about, and there were too many people for me to unfollow. So I deleted my Twitter account for a while, and I am back now, though. You can follow me at jjohnson_news. Same handle as last time, except instead of AW, it is now news after the underscore. I'm also on Facebook, where you can subscribe on our American Watchmen page. And on Instagram, I believe, at official Joshua Johnson 2016 or Joshua Johnson 2016 or something like that. But
and have you been writing pieces for American Watchmen lately? I know people can go and find your work in this podcast.
I need to do a better job of getting a few columns out. I've been silent for the last few weeks.
Yeah, boy.
Not because of some personal issues I had going on, but I should have a piece coming out soon. Yes.
Yeah. Well, we both need to start writing content. But yeah, go and check out American Watchmen too. You'll be able to read Josh's past columns and some of mine too. So, but anyway, Josh, thanks as always for coming on the podcast and making sense of this whole foreign policy debacle. I really appreciate it. So,
thank you. It's good to be on the show again.
And folks, we'll be right back after this. And with that, we are back. That was a pre-recorded interview. I forgot to label that as a pre-recorded interview. You'll have to forgive me, folks. I'm still learning my way around OBS. Producer Cannabear. Producer Cannabear is. Let's be honest. He's producing content for the whole entire Unbearables team mostly, and unfortunately he's not around. He has been giving me tips though on how to use OBS. So, bit of a rocky start to the show, but overall I think it's gone really well. I do want to get to some of the comments here. Bicentennial Bear in the stream says, trust the president. He has the right. Let me pull up this window. He has the right people in our military defense team. Don't be so quick to jump ship. Bicentennial, I'm not jumping ship quite yet. My whole point being, at the very least, is that this operation, I don't want it to become another 10-year war like the Iraq war became. I do think that there are foreign interests out there that I do think that there are interests within our own government and foreign multinational corporations that would like to see us in endless wars. I do think that type of thing does exist. But at the same time, I'm not quite at the level that Mike Cernovich is yet, where I'm kind of indifferent, as to whether or not Trump gets elected. I still think foreign policy-wise, as well as domestically, Trump is a hell of a better president than Clinton would have ever been, and I'm not going to back away from saying that. But at the same time, I do think that Trump. One of Trump's big appeals among libertarians was the fact that he wasn't necessarily a non-interventionalist, but that he, but that he didn't believe in fighting big foreign wars, which I think anyone with common sense believes that we shouldn't be fighting wars all the time either. So Syria is a very complex issue, and there's not a lot that we can, right now, people on Twitter are saying that World War III is starting, and some of those people, obviously, they're posting memes and being funny about it, but then we also have people who are being realistic. I don't think we're at World War III. I think to say that we're headed towards World War III is premature. To put it nicely, it's premature at best. At worst, it's asinine to say that. Chuberica says we have a real warrior leading our military right now. This is a perfect time to get as much accomplished as possible. I couldn't agree more with this. But part of being a good warrior is to get in, get out, and get the mission accomplished. Instead of dragging wars out is not a good military strategy. I mean, I'm not a soldier, obviously, and I'm not as up on military tactics and whatnot. But fighting an endless war like we were in the Middle East was not a good strategy. You do need it's just like a business. You need a solid plan and you need to execute it and just get it done. Chuberica also brings up a good point. I also find it odd that all the MSM Russian collusion talk has evaporated into thin air. I don't know. Chuberica, I really don't find that odd. Most likely what will happen is the Russia talk will be back, believe me, you. I've noticed that the media likes to take breaks from that every once in a while. They like to change it up. First, it's Russian collusion. Next, it's Stormy Daniels. You know, who knows? They might bring back the whole Russia piss thing. I mean, the media has so many non-stories regarding Trump that they like to cycle through that it is somewhat ridiculous. And that's what they're going to do. They're going to keep focusing on non-stories. And real quick, for all of you out there who are on the alt-right, who are saying that somehow that the Jews are responsible for this conflict in the Middle East. I've already blocked a lot of you, but feel free to just block me or hide me from your profile, because anti-Semitism will not stand. And furthermore, there's no evidence to suggest that the Jews, as you like to scoffingly say, are behind this. Hey, Island Bear, welcome to the stream. In other news, the Mark Zuckerberg thing, Juberica was talking earlier about the Russia Gate thing evaporating into thin air, but what about the Mark Zuckerberg congressional hearing, huh? That came and went, and well, right now in the news, it's kind of died like a wet fart, so to speak. I mean, no one's really talking about it anymore. So, that's that. And I want to thank you guys for watching the show tonight. Hey, Dylan Bear, for thank you for jumping in here as well. I want to thank Bicentennial Bear, Berta Bear, Chuberica. Let's see. Erwin Benjamin, of course, who was pretty much spamming. Chris Adams. Is Chris one of the Bears? I don't think I've seen him before. Well, I think I've seen him. Yeah. Southern Bear was in here under her real name, and then of course Cannabear, who I hope you're getting good sleep. Also, apologies to John Neary, who I guess started a stream during my stream, and I doubt that. Well, I mean, I know he kind of has his own audience, but we also share an audience. So, John, if your audience on your stream was lower tonight than usual, I apologize. They were probably all over here watching me and watching Joshua Johnson, who I've been trying to convince to join the Unbearables. He doesn't really understand what the Bears are, but I'll convince him to join soon enough. Also, to answer your question from the chat earlier, yes, Bicentennial, I actually am on Gab. So that concludes tonight's show. Real quick, it's time to plug. So if you like this video on YouTube, share, like, comment, subscribe. If you're on Periscope, obviously, tap the screen to give it hearts and quote retweet and all that stuff. You can find me online at any of these locations down here. You can follow me on Twitter at SamW_NGC, although I think I'm shadow banned right now. Apparently, from what I understand, shadow banning is when people who follow you can see your tweets, but no one else can. That's kind of my understanding. I don't know if I'm shadow banned. I thought I was shadow banned earlier this week, but then I wasn't. But who knows? I'm also on Gab at Sam Whitfield, where I'm actually verified because I'm a pro user over there, and it's worth going pro. It's $60 a year, $30 if you're a student, which is how I'm doing it, and it helps to keep Gab up and running. And contrary to what you'll hear about Gab, it's not an entirely alt-right platform. There are a lot of seedy characters on there, but there are also a lot of liberty-minded individuals who are just sick of the censorship on Facebook and Twitter. Another good place to find me, interestingly enough, on social is Instagram. That's one of the places where I can post stuff, and that never gets censored, although I don't really post political stuff. I post more like food and music and photography over there. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts from, and so on and so forth. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you all adieu. Good night. God bless. God save this great nation. And thank you for watching the Whitfield Report. We will see you next week.